I told my cousin they could have the item back over my dead body. They took that as permission. Give it back, my cousin Maverick said coldly. It hadn't even been 2 days since Grandma's passing, and he was already selling every belonging that ever mattered to her. He reached out to swipe the last family heirloom from my hands, but I stepped back just in time. No, I told him sharply. You literally sold it to me yesterday. Why do you want it back? He rolled his eyes. That's none of your business, and I told you I'll even pay you triple, so what's the holdup? This is the last thing I have of Grandma, and I plan on cherishing it unlike you, I said. I rushed to my car and locked it. Maverick stood there tugging at the door handle, cursing at me until I drove away. Not even 5 minutes later, he started spamming my phone with calls and texts, calling me selfish, accusing me of knowing the heirloom was worth $400,000, not the $500 he'd sold it for. But I hadn't known. I'd only taken it because of a promise I made to Grandma before she passed. But Maverick refused to let it go. He had a lawyer come out to my house and physically hand me a 3-page letter accusing me of fraud, threatening to take me to court for the emotional distress I was causing everyone. I took the papers with a smile and contacted my own lawyer, who later confirmed there was definitely no case. It was a clear transaction. Then his wife came knocking on my door. She was calm, reasonable even. Look, I know this has gotten out of hand, she said, but we really need that money. Can we work something out? For family harmony? I made a promise to my grandmother, I told her. Her face turned dark. Don't say I didn't warn you, she muttered before leaving. That's when my neighbor walked over. Everything all right? I've been seeing a car parked outside your house, he said. 3 days in a row. Same car. If I were you, I'd keep up my security. You never know when it comes to family. Just a day later, Maverick started upping his antics, threatening notes on my door, my car keyed with the words, greedy traitor. Then one day, Maverick followed me to my workplace. He grabbed me and started screaming in my face right there in the lobby. You really want to play games? Because I'll show you what happens to people who play games with me. That's when I knew I had to go to the police. I showed up at the station with everything. Photos of my keyed car, screenshots of his threatening texts, a statement from my manager about the workplace incident. The officer looked through it all and sighed. Look, I understand your concern, but unless he physically harms you or makes an explicit threat of violence, there's not much we can do. If it escalates, come back. I left feeling more helpless than before. When I got home, my neighbor was sitting on his porch. He saw the defeated look on my face and walked over immediately. Hey, I'm right next door. I'll keep watching out for you. If I see anything suspicious, I'll let you know. I instantly felt safer. Thank you, I said with a light smile. Really, I don't know what I'd do without you looking out for me. He smiled back. That's what neighbors are for. That night, I actually slept soundly. Unfortunately, I shouldn't have. The smoke alarm woke me at 3 in the morning. I smelled it before I saw it. Smoke pouring under my bedroom door. I grabbed the heirloom from my nightstand and ran to the bathroom, soaking a towel with water and wrapping it as carefully as I could around the heirloom. When I opened the door again, the entire bedroom and hallway was filled with smoke, and at the end of it stood Maverick with a grin on his face as he blocked the entrance. Give it to me, he said. You set my house on fire for this? I screamed, coughing at the smoke. No, taking your life has always been the goal. The heirloom is just a bonus. He ran straight at me, making me drop the heirloom to the floor as we struggled in that burning hallway, slamming from wall to wall. After a minute, he won. His hands grabbed it as I was pinned down, my face just inches from a flame. Then I saw it. The flame grew larger on his jacket sleeve. Maverick stumbled back, screaming, Come on! I'll get you out. My neighbor suddenly appeared through the smoke. He grabbed the heirloom and pulled me toward the exit while Maverick continued to struggle. By the time I made it out, police cars were already there with the paramedics. Your neighbor called and showed us the footage of a man setting your house on fire, one officer explained. My neighbor grinned. I told you I'd have your back. My neighbor guided me to his house while the paramedics rushed to Maverick and worked to treat his burns. Thank you for saving me, I said finally. Can I have the heirloom back now? My neighbor stood by the window, turning it over in his hands a couple times, examining it closely. Oh, this? His voice was different now, almost evil. Do you even know how long I've been waiting to have this? Then he looked at me, peeling off the fake mustache and hair. You're not getting it back. It hit me like cold water. Dad? I heard myself ask. He didn't even flinch when I said it. My father just kept turning the heirloom over in his hands, examining it like I wasn't even there. The fake mustache hung from one side of his face, and I could see now how wrong everything had been. The helpful neighbor routine, the security cameras, the perfect timing to save me. It was all planned. He took a step toward the back door, and panic shot through me because I knew if he walked out right now, I'd never see that heirloom again. I lunged forward and grabbed for it, my fingers brushing the edge before his hand shoved me hard into the wall. Pain exploded in my shoulder as I hit the doorframe and stumbled. By the time I recovered, he was already through the back door, running toward a car parked in the alley behind his house. I chased after him, but my legs felt weak, and my lungs still burned from the smoke. His car door slammed and the engine started. I reached the alley just in time to watch his taillights disappear around the corner. I stood there in the borrowed clothes he'd given me, covered in soot, watching my father drive away with the one thing I'd promised Grandma I would protect. The cold air hit my skin, and I realized I was shaking. I turned and ran back toward my house, or what was left of it. The police cars were still there with their lights flashing red and blue across the burned walls. Firefighters were spraying water on the parts still smoking. I found one of the officers who'd responded and grabbed his arm. The words came out in a rush as I explained what just happened. My neighbor wasn't my neighbor. He was my father. He'd stolen the heirloom. The officer pulled out his notepad and started writing everything down. He asked for a description of the car and which direction my father went. I gave him everything I could remember, but my mind felt fuzzy. Another officer joined us, and they both listened as I explained the whole situation. When I finished, the first officer closed his notepad and looked toward the ambulance where paramedics were still working on Maverick. He told me they'd add the theft to the report, but right now they needed to focus on getting my cousin to the hospital since his burns were serious. I felt helpless standing there watching them prioritize the person who tried to kill me over the person who just robbed me. A paramedic walked over and asked if I'd been checked out yet. I said I was fine, but she insisted, taking my arm and leading me toward the ambulance. She made me sit on the back bumper and put a mask over my face. The oxygen tasted strange and cold. She said something about elevated carbon monoxide levels and how I needed treatment. I sat there with the mask on, watching the firefighters spray water on what was left of my home. Everything I owned, except the clothes on my back and my phone in my pocket, was either burned or soaked. The heirloom that caused all of this was gone. Maverick was loaded into an ambulance on a stretcher. My father was driving away with $400,000 worth of stolen property. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe normally through the mask. A car pulled up around 4 a.m., and a man in a suit got out. He walked over and showed his badge to the officers, then headed straight for me. He introduced himself as Detective Williams and asked if I could walk him through everything that happened tonight. I pulled the oxygen mask off and started from the beginning. Grandma's death, Maverick selling me the heirloom, the harassment and threats, the fire, my neighbor saving me, and then revealing himself as my father before stealing the heirloom. Detective Williams wrote everything down in a small notebook, asking questions about timing and details. He walked over to the officer who had the security footage from my father's cameras, and they watched it together on a laptop. I could see the screen from where I sat. There was Maverick breaking my window and pouring something inside. There was the flash when he lit it. Detective Williams came back and said the video was solid evidence for the arson case. He asked for my father's full name and a description of his car. I gave him everything I remembered. The detective promised to put out alerts for my father and his vehicle, but warned me that recovery might take time since my father already had an 8-hour head start. The paramedic came back and said I needed to go to the hospital for more observation. I refused. I had no insurance and no money for an emergency room visit. She argued with me for a few minutes but finally gave up when I signed something saying I was leaving against medical advice. Detective Williams offered to give me a ride somewhere. I asked him to drop me at the cheap motel near the hospital. The sun was starting to come up when he pulled into the parking lot. I used my credit card to pay for a room. The clerk barely looked at me as she handed over the key. The room smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning chemicals. I sat on the bed and pulled out my phone. 23 missed calls, dozens of text messages, all from relatives who'd heard about the fire, everyone asking if I was okay, if the heirloom survived. I didn't have the energy to explain that my own father stole it. I sent the same reply to everyone saying I was safe and dealing with police. Then I turned off my phone and lay back on the bed. The pillow felt too soft after everything. I stared at the ceiling tiles and tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment my father pulled off that fake mustache. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I heard his voice saying I wasn't getting the heirloom back. Morning light came through the thin curtains. I gave up on sleep and turned my phone back on. More messages. I ignored them and called my lawyer. She answered on the third ring, and I could hear the concern in her voice when I explained what happened. She told me to come to her office right away. We needed to file charges against my father for theft before he had time to sell the heirloom. I got up and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. My face was streaked with soot. My hair was a mess. I still smelled like smoke. I washed my face and hands in the sink, but it didn't help much. The lawyer's office was downtown. I walked in still wearing the borrowed clothes from last night. My lawyer took one look at me, and her expression softened. She brought me into her office and we sat down. She explained we needed to act fast. She started drafting an emergency motion for a protective order while I signed papers. She filed a civil action to recover the property. The legal terms washed over me as I signed wherever she pointed. When we finished, she gently suggested I go buy some basic clothes before our afternoon meeting with the prosecutor. I left her office and found a discount store 3 blocks away. I walked through the aisles picking up 3 days' worth of clothes and some toiletries. The normalcy of shopping felt bizarre. I'd almost died last night. The cashier made small talk about the weather while scanning my items. I just nodded. She had no idea I was basically homeless. I caught my reflection in the store window on my way out. The person staring back looked exhausted and lost. I barely recognized myself. The prosecutor's office was in the same building as the courthouse. I sat in a waiting room for 30 minutes before someone called my name. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes. She reviewed both cases while I sat across from her desk. She said they'd definitely charge Maverick with arson and attempted murder. The video evidence was clear, and he'd basically confessed at the scene. For my father, they could charge him with theft, but they needed to locate him first to make an arrest. I left feeling like justice was moving forward with Maverick, but completely stalled with my father. My insurance company sent someone to assess the damage that afternoon. The adjuster was a middle-aged woman who took photos of everything while explaining how the claims process worked. She warned me that arson cases took longer to settle because they needed the criminal investigation to close first. I asked about temporary housing help. She clicked through something on her tablet and said she could approve a small advance for 2 weeks at an extended stay motel. Anything beyond that would depend on how quickly the case moved through the system. I pulled out my phone and started searching for local pawn shops. The first 3 owners I called listened to my description of the heirloom and promised to watch for it. One woman even took down my number and said she'd spread the word to other dealers in the area. The 4th shop owner laughed when I described the piece. He told me items worth that much never came through regular shops. His dismissive tone made my stomach drop. My father probably had connections to private collectors or dealers who worked outside normal channels. I thanked him anyway and hung up feeling more helpless than before. I called 2 more shops, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. Detective Williams called while I was sitting in my car outside a gas station. Maverick was stable with second-degree burns on his arms and chest. The hospital would discharge him in a few days, and police would arrest him immediately. The detective mentioned they found evidence in my burned house showing Maverick planned the attack for days. Receipts for the accelerant he used were in his car. Knowing he'd been plotting to kill me instead of acting on impulse somehow made everything worse. I thanked Detective Williams and ended the call. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to hurt. I needed to do something instead of just sitting around waiting. I drove to my father's rental house even though I knew he was long gone. The landlord was already there changing the locks when I pulled up. He recognized me from when I'd visited my supposed neighbor before. He explained my father paid rent through the end of the month but cleared out overnight. I asked if I could look inside. The landlord shrugged and let me in. The house was completely empty except for the couch and table that came with the rental. No clothes in the closets, no food in the kitchen, no personal items anywhere. I stood in the living room feeling stupid for never questioning why my helpful neighbor had so little stuff visible. The landlord asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine and left. My lawyer called while I was driving back to the motel. She wanted to file an emergency protective order against my father. She argued he was dangerous based on the theft and his connection to Maverick's arson. I agreed immediately and drove straight to her office. We filled out the paperwork together, and she filed it that afternoon. The judge granted a temporary order, but said we needed a full hearing within 2 weeks to make it permanent. My lawyer assured me this was standard procedure. I knew a piece of paper wouldn't stop my father if he really wanted the heirloom, but at least it was something. I left her office and checked my phone. It was only 2 in the afternoon, but I felt exhausted. My hands started shaking again while I was driving. I'd barely slept since the fire. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flames and smoke. I called the therapist number my insurance company recommended. They had an opening that same afternoon. The therapist was a woman in her 50s with a calm voice. She asked about my sleep patterns and the shaking. I explained everything about the fire and my father's betrayal. She diagnosed me with acute stress response. She taught me breathing exercises for when the panic attacks hit. I practiced the breathing pattern in her office until my hands stopped shaking. She wrote me a prescription for short-term anxiety medication and scheduled another appointment for next week. I left feeling slightly less like I was losing my mind. Detective Williams called again the next morning. Traffic cameras spotted my father's car heading toward the state border. They lost the trail after that. He suggested my father might try to get the heirloom appraised out of state, where the theft alert hadn't spread yet. I spent the rest of the day calling auction houses in neighboring states. Most of them took down my information and promised to contact police if anyone brought in a piece matching my description. One appraiser asked detailed questions about the heirloom's markings and took extensive notes. I felt like I was getting ahead of my father for once, instead of just reacting. Someone knocked on my motel room door that evening. I looked through the peephole and saw Maverick's wife standing there. I almost didn't open it. She slid a note under the door saying she wanted to help. I cracked the door open with the chain still attached. She looked tired and stressed. She explained Maverick had gambling debts over $60,000. He was desperate enough to do anything for the heirloom's value. She offered to testify against him in exchange for the prosecutor going easier on her since she didn't know about the arson plan. I told her to contact my lawyer directly and gave her the business card. She thanked me and left. My lawyer called that same evening. Maverick's wife provided useful information about his financial situation and timeline. The details strengthened the attempted murder case significantly. My lawyer mentioned the wife was filing for divorce and wanted nothing to do with Maverick's legal troubles. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction that Maverick's life was falling apart and guilt that his wife was another casualty of his greed. I couldn't sleep that night, so I started going through old family photos on my laptop. I was looking for any information about my father that might help locate him. I found a folder of documents Grandma had scanned years ago. One letter from 15 years back mentioned my father being cut out of her will after stealing jewelry from her house. That explained why he wasn't at her funeral. He had a history of stealing from family. I was just his latest target. The Helpful Neighbor Act was always a con from the start. Detective Williams called the next morning requesting I come to the station. They got a warrant to search my father's rental house and collected evidence. I drove over immediately. The detective showed me everything they found laid out on a table in the evidence room. 3 fake IDs in different names. Printed research about the heirloom's value and history going back weeks. Directions to several high-end auction houses in 3 different states. Detective Williams explained my father was likely a professional con artist who targeted family members during vulnerable times like funerals. The level of planning was extensive and deliberate. I stared at the fake IDs and felt sick. My father had been watching me and planning this theft long before the fire ever happened. Detective Williams gathered up the fake IDs and research papers, sliding them back into evidence bags. He mentioned the prosecutor wanted to meet with me and my lawyer about Maverick's case, and we scheduled it for later that afternoon. I left the station feeling drained from seeing how long my father had been planning this con. My lawyer met me at the prosecutor's office 3 hours later, and we sat across from a tired-looking woman with stacks of case files on her desk. She explained Maverick was facing 25 years if convicted at trial for arson and attempted murder, but she was willing to offer 15 years if he took a plea deal and gave a full statement at his sentencing hearing. My lawyer leaned over and explained this was actually reasonable given the video evidence and Maverick's confession at the scene. The prosecutor added that a trial could take 8 months to a year, while the plea would resolve everything within weeks. I thought about spending another year dealing with court dates and testimony, reliving that burning hallway over and over. I told the prosecutor I supported the plea deal because I wanted this finished, so I could focus on getting the heirloom back. She nodded and said she'd contact Maverick's public defender to start the paperwork. I felt relieved walking out of that office knowing at least one part of this nightmare was moving toward closure. My phone rang 2 days later from a blocked number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. My father's voice came through asking if I was ready to be reasonable about splitting the heirloom's value. He offered me $20,000 to drop the theft charges and let him sell it, saying we both deserved something from Grandma since Maverick had caused all this trouble. I gripped the phone tighter and told him I made a promise to her that I intended to keep. He started to argue, but I hung up before he could finish. My hands were shaking as I pulled up Detective Williams' number and called him right away. The detective asked me to come to the station and give a statement about the call since my father had violated the protective order by contacting me directly. I drove over and spent an hour writing down everything my father said, including the exact dollar amount he offered. Detective Williams explained, this showed my father still had the heirloom and was actively trying to sell it, which helped their case. He also warned me my father might try calling again now that he knew my number. My lawyer called me the next morning and asked me to come to her office right away. She had a serious look on her face when I arrived and explained we needed to record any future calls from my father since he'd already violated the protective order once. She pulled out her laptop and walked me through downloading a call recording app on my phone, showing me how to activate it quickly if another blocked number appeared. We spent the next hour going over what I should say if my father called again, with her coaching me to keep him talking as long as possible and try to get him to reveal where he was keeping the heirloom. She warned me not to agree to anything or make any promises, just gather information. I left her office with the app installed and a script of questions written in my notes. That night, I lay in my motel bed staring at my phone on the nightstand, part of me hoping he'd call so we could get evidence, but also dreading hearing his voice again. Every time a car drove past outside, I jumped, thinking it might be him coming to confront me in person. I barely slept and kept checking my phone every few minutes to make sure the recording app was still working. The insurance adjuster called the next afternoon with better news. She explained they'd approved a partial advance of $5,000 for my immediate needs, though the full claim wouldn't process until the arson investigation officially closed. I felt a wave of relief knowing I could extend my motel stay for another month, instead of worrying about where I'd sleep next week. She transferred the money that same day, and I used part of it to pay the motel through the end of next month. I drove to an electronics store and bought a basic laptop to replace the one that burned, needing it to search for apartments and handle all the legal paperwork. The adjuster mentioned it could be 6 months before I saw the rest of the insurance payout, which meant I needed to find more permanent housing soon, since the advance wouldn't cover much beyond 2 months. I started looking at cheap apartments online that evening, trying to find something affordable that didn't require a long lease. Most places wanted first month, last month, and a security deposit up front, which would eat up most of my remaining advance money. I bookmarked a few possibilities but felt overwhelmed, trying to plan for a future that still felt so uncertain. Detective Williams called me 4 days later, sounding excited. A high-end auction house in a neighboring state had contacted him about someone trying to consign an item matching the heirloom's description. The auction house flagged it as suspicious because the seller couldn't provide proper paperwork showing where he got it or proving it belonged to him. They had security footage of my father using a fake name and trying to pressure them into taking it immediately. Detective Williams explained he was working with police in that state to set up watching the auction house in case my father came back. He asked me to send over any photos I had of the heirloom so they could confirm it was the same piece. I forwarded him 3 pictures from my phone that I'd taken right after buying it from Maverick, back when I thought the biggest problem I'd face was my cousin's anger. The detective said he'd call me as soon as they had any updates, and for the first time since the fire, I felt actual hope that we might recover it. I couldn't wait for updates, so I called the auction house myself the next morning and asked to speak with the director. She was surprisingly willing to talk and invited me to come see the security footage in person. I drove 3 hours to get there, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight the whole way. The director met me at the front desk and led me back to her office where she pulled up the footage on her computer. Seeing my father's face on that screen filled me with cold anger that made my chest tight. He was wearing different clothes than I'd ever seen him in and using confident gestures like he owned the place. The director explained they told him they needed 2 weeks to authenticate the piece, which bought us time to get law enforcement involved. She mentioned she'd dealt with stolen property before and treated this like a routine business problem, checking boxes on a form while we talked. Her calm, professional attitude somehow made me feel more hopeful about actually recovering the heirloom. She said my father seemed nervous when they asked for documentation and left quickly after scheduling a follow-up appointment he'd probably never keep. I called my lawyer from the auction house parking lot and explained everything the director had shown me. She said she'd file an emergency injunction right away to prevent any sale or transfer of the heirloom. I drove home feeling like we were finally getting ahead of my father instead of just reacting to whatever he did next. My lawyer called me back 3 hours later saying the judge granted the injunction immediately based on the auction house evidence and my father's criminal charges. We served the injunction on the auction house that same afternoon, and the director confirmed by email that they'd hold the item and not release it to my father under any circumstances. She also mentioned she'd installed additional security cameras and instructed her staff to call police immediately if my father showed up. I read her email twice, hardly believing we'd actually blocked one of his options for selling the heirloom. Detective Williams called that evening to say the auction house was fully cooperating, and he'd arranged for local police to do extra patrols around their building. My phone rang from a blocked number 2 days later, and I grabbed it fast, opening the recording app before I answered. My father's voice came through angry this time, demanding I drop the injunction and stop interfering with his business. I stayed calm like my lawyer coached me, and asked why he was so upset about a piece that supposedly belonged to him. He threatened to destroy the heirloom if I didn't cooperate, saying he'd rather break it than let me have it. I asked him where he was keeping it, trying to sound concerned instead of investigative. He started to say something about a storage unit before catching himself and going quiet. I heard him breathing hard on the other end before he hung up without another word. I immediately sent the recording file to Detective Williams with a text explaining my father had mentioned a storage unit. The detective called me back within minutes, asking me to email him the full recording and promising to follow up on the storage unit lead. Detective Williams worked fast and called me the next morning. He'd pulled rental records for storage facilities in the area where the auction house was located and found 3 units rented under variations of my father's fake names from the evidence we'd collected. He got warrants to search all 3 units and asked if I wanted to be there when they executed them. I said yes immediately and started driving up that same afternoon. The 3-hour drive felt like 10, with my mind racing about potentially getting the heirloom back today. I kept imagining opening a storage unit door and seeing it sitting there safe, ready to bring home. Detective Williams called halfway through my drive to confirm the timing and remind me I'd have to stay back while officers conducted the actual search. I didn't care about watching as long as they recovered it. I met him at the first storage facility at 4 in the afternoon, watching from beside his car as officers cut the lock and rolled up the metal door. The first unit was completely empty, except for some dust and a dead spider in the corner. The second unit had old furniture and boxes of random junk that clearly didn't belong to my father. Officers searched through everything anyway, opening boxes and checking inside drawers, but found nothing related to the heirloom. The third unit looked more promising when we first opened it, because there were packing materials and bubble wrap scattered on the floor. Detective Williams pulled on gloves and started going through everything carefully while I stood at the entrance trying to see past him. He found research documents about the heirloom's history and printed articles about its value, but no sign of the actual piece. My father had clearly moved it after realizing the auction house was suspicious about his lack of documentation. I felt crushing disappointment watching officers close and lock the empty units, my hope from this morning completely gone. Detective Williams walked over and put a hand on my shoulder, saying the evidence of the rental still proved my father had possession, even if we hadn't recovered the item yet. He explained this strengthened the theft case and showed a pattern of planning that prosecutors could use. I nodded, but couldn't shake the sick feeling that my father was always one step ahead, moving the heirloom every time we got close. I drove back to the motel in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to hurt. The 3-hour drive felt longer this time, because I kept replaying the empty storage units in my head. When I got to my room, I spread the copied documents across the bed and started reading through everything Detective Williams had given me. My father had pages of research on the heirloom going back months, sales records from auctions where similar pieces sold, notes about private collectors who bought items like this, contact information for dealers in 3 different states. He'd even printed articles about the heirloom's history that included details I didn't know myself. One page had a timeline written in his handwriting showing when Grandma got sick, when she died, when Maverick would likely try to sell her belongings. He'd planned this whole thing before she even passed away, just waiting for his chance. I found notes about me too, my work schedule, the route I took home, how often I checked my security cameras. Seeing it all laid out like that made my skin crawl, because it meant he'd been watching me for weeks, or maybe months, before he moved in next door. The neighbor act wasn't something he came up with on the spot. He'd researched the rental house, created a whole fake identity, bought props like that mustache and different clothes. This was his job and I was just another target. I stayed up past midnight reading through everything twice, trying to find some clue about where he might go next, but there was nothing. He was too careful to leave that kind of information lying around. My phone rang the next morning while I was drinking bad motel coffee. My lawyer's name showed on the screen. She told me Maverick had officially accepted the plea deal that morning at the courthouse. 15 years for arson and attempted murder, with the prosecutor recommending he serve the full sentence. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks from today. She explained I had the right to give a victim impact statement if I wanted, describing how the crime affected me and what I thought the sentence should be. I said yes immediately because I wanted that judge to hear exactly what Maverick put me through. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and started writing. The words came easier than I expected. I described waking up to smoke filling my house, the terror of being trapped in that hallway with flames everywhere, watching Maverick block my escape while he grinned. I wrote about losing everything I owned, living in this cheap motel for weeks, the nightmares that woke me up most nights. I wrote about the betrayal of family turning violent over money, about making a promise to my dying grandmother that almost got me killed. 3 pages came out in one sitting, and when I read it back, my hands were shaking. Putting it all into words made it feel real again, in a way I'd been trying to avoid, but it also felt good, like I was taking back some control by making sure my voice got heard. I saved the document and sent a copy to my lawyer for review. She called back an hour later saying it was powerful and appropriate for the hearing. 2 days after that, Detective Williams called with news that made my heart race. A private collector had contacted him saying someone approached him about buying a valuable heirloom, matching our description for cash. The collector recognized it from the alerts the detective had sent to dealers and collectors across multiple states. He wanted to help set up a sting operation. Detective Williams explained the plan quickly. The collector would agree to a meeting to see the item and discuss price. Police would set up surveillance around the meeting location and move in once my father showed the heirloom. The collector was willing to wear a wire so they could record everything. I felt hope rising in my chest for the first time since the storage units came up empty. This could actually work if my father didn't suspect anything. The detective said the meeting was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon at the collector's home office. He asked if I wanted to wait at the police station while they monitored everything remotely. I said yes, because there was no way I could just sit at the motel, wondering what was happening. The next day dragged by until it was time to head to the station. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon, and Detective Williams brought me to a break room where his team had set up monitors, showing feeds from cameras outside the collector's house. The collector was wearing a wire that transmitted audio to speakers in the room. I sat in a plastic chair and poured myself coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting there since morning. The coffee tasted burnt, but I drank it anyway, needing something to do with my hands. Detective Williams explained his team was positioned in unmarked cars around the block, ready to move in fast once my father showed the heirloom. The collector had been coached to ask to examine the piece before discussing money, giving police time to confirm it was the real item before making the arrest. I watched the clock on the wall tick past 3, then 4. The collector sat in his office looking at his phone, occasionally glancing toward the window. Nothing happened. I paced the break room, refilled my coffee twice, checked my own phone for messages that never came. By 5 o'clock, Detective Williams was frowning at the monitors. At 5:30, one of the officers radioed in that they'd found a note in the collector's mailbox. The deal was off. My father never showed up. Detective Williams played back the surveillance footage, and we watched cars driving past the collector's house all afternoon, but none of them stopped. Somewhere in that footage, my father had probably driven by and spotted the unmarked police cars, or noticed something else that tipped him off. The detective said my father was more careful and paranoid than they'd thought, which meant catching him would be harder. He suggested my father might have been watching the collector's house earlier in the day and saw them setting up the surveillance equipment. I drove back to the motel feeling worse than before because we'd been so close. That night around 9, my phone rang from a blocked number. I grabbed it and opened the recording app before answering. My father's voice came through sounding almost amused. He said he'd watched the police set up their little trap at the collector's house, counted 4 unmarked cars, and spotted the camera they'd installed in the tree across the street. He told me I was wasting everyone's time trying to catch him because he'd been doing this for 20 years and knew every trick. His voice had this cocky edge that made me want to throw the phone across the room. I kept him talking, asking questions about where he was and what his plan was, while texting Detective Williams with my other hand that I was on a call. My father rambled for almost 10 minutes about how the heirloom belonged to him more than it belonged to me, how Grandma had always favored me and cut him out unfairly. I let him talk, hoping the detective could trace the call. Finally, my father seemed to realize he'd been on too long and hung up without saying goodbye. I immediately called Detective Williams and sent him the recording file. He said he'd work on tracing the number and call me back. An hour later, he called to say the trace showed my father had been using a burner phone from a cell tower near a motel about 40 miles away. Police responded to the area and checked motels near that tower, but by the time they arrived, my father had already checked out. The motel clerk said he'd left about 20 minutes after our call ended, paying cash and driving away in a different car than the one we had on file. Detective Williams explained my father was staying mobile and using cash for everything to avoid leaving a trail. It made him harder to track, but also limited his options for selling the heirloom because serious buyers wanted documentation and verification. The detective thought my father would eventually make a mistake when he got desperate for money. My therapy session that week was rough. I sat in the therapist's office and told her about the failed sting operation and my father's mocking phone call. She asked how I was handling the ongoing stress, and I admitted I felt like I was barely holding it together. She pointed out something I hadn't wanted to see. I was handling all the practical stuff fine, working with the detective and my lawyer, documenting everything, following the legal process. But I wasn't dealing with the emotional side at all. I wasn't letting myself grieve the fact that my father had betrayed me, or that my cousin had tried to kill me. I was just pushing forward, focusing on getting the heirloom back, avoiding the deeper hurt underneath. She said I needed to start processing those feelings, or they'd catch up with me eventually. We spent the rest of the session talking about trust, and how I'd let people into my life without protecting myself. She helped me see patterns I'd been repeating, assuming family would act like family, not questioning when things seemed too convenient. I left her office feeling raw and exposed, but also like I'd finally started dealing with the real damage instead of just the surface problems. 3 weeks later, I put on my best clothes and drove to the courthouse for Maverick's sentencing hearing. The courtroom was cold and formal, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired. Maverick sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled. He didn't look at me when I walked in. The judge called me up to read my victim impact statement. I stood at the podium with my printed pages and read every word I'd written about that night. My voice shook at first, but got stronger as I went. I described the smoke, the flames, the moment I thought I was going to die. I talked about losing my home and everything in it, about the nightmares and panic attacks, about what it felt like to have family try to murder me over money. When I finished, I looked directly at Maverick and said I hoped he spent every day of his sentence thinking about what he'd done. His lawyer stood up and argued for leniency, talking about Maverick's gambling addiction and mental health issues, how he'd been desperate and not thinking clearly. The prosecutor pushed back hard, pointing out the premeditation shown by the accelerant purchases and the planning involved. The judge listened to both sides and then announced the sentence. 15 years with credit for time served. Maverick would be eligible for parole after serving 12 years if he maintained good behavior. I watched 2 bailiffs lead him away in handcuffs and felt something settle in my chest. At least one person was facing real consequences for what they'd done. 2 days after the sentencing, Detective Williams called with another lead. Traffic cameras had caught my father's car near a town about 60 miles away that was known for having underground antique dealers who didn't ask too many questions about where items came from. The detective was coordinating with local police in that area to watch the known dealers and see if my father showed up at any of them. He explained that most criminals eventually make mistakes when they get desperate, and my father had been on the run for almost 2 months now. He had to be running low on cash, which meant he'd need to sell the heirloom soon. The detective told me to stay ready, because when my father finally surfaced, things would move fast. I hung up, feeling cautiously hopeful again, knowing we were getting closer even if it didn't feel like it yet. 3 weeks later, the insurance company finally sent the settlement letter. I opened it standing in my motel room and saw the number $42,000 printed in bold letters. It wasn't enough to replace everything I'd lost in the fire, but it was enough to start over somewhere new. I called the insurance adjuster to confirm the check would arrive within 5 business days, and she explained the claim had processed faster now that Maverick's criminal case was resolved and the arson investigation was officially closed. I thanked her and hung up, feeling like I could finally breathe again after months of uncertainty. The next morning, I started searching for apartments online, scrolling through listings during my lunch break at work. Most places in my old neighborhood felt wrong, too many memories of the fire and everything that happened. I expanded my search to different areas and found a small 1-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes away with good reviews for building security. The listing showed a second-floor unit with a reinforced door and a security camera system in the hallways. I scheduled a viewing for that weekend and spent the rest of the week imagining what it would feel like to have my own space again, instead of living out of a motel room. The apartment was even better in person than the photos showed. The landlord walked me through the unit, pointing out the new locks on the doors and windows, the smoke detectors that were hardwired into the building's system, and the emergency exit routes clearly marked. I signed the lease that same day and put down the first month's rent and security deposit, leaving me with enough insurance money to buy furniture and start rebuilding my life. Moving day came 2 weeks later, and I spent the morning loading boxes into a rental truck with help from a couple co-workers who'd offered to assist. We were carrying my new couch up the stairs when my phone rang. Detective Williams's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately, my heart racing. He told me to sit down because he had major news. My father had been arrested at a motel about 60 miles away after the clerk recognized him from the wanted posters that had been circulating. The police had executed a search warrant on his motel room and found the heirloom in the room's safe, though it had visible smoke and water damage from being wrapped in that wet towel during the fire. I felt my legs go weak and sat down right there on the stairs, barely registering my co-workers asking if I was okay. Detective Williams explained the heirloom was transported to the police station and I could come identify it whenever I was ready. I thanked him and ended the call, then looked at my co-workers and told them I needed to go to the police station right now. They helped me finish unloading the truck quickly, asking questions about what happened, and I gave them the short version while we worked. Within an hour, I was driving to the station, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The relief of knowing the heirloom was recovered, mixed with anxiety about what condition it would be in after everything it had been through. Detective Williams met me in the lobby and led me to an evidence room where the heirloom sat on a table under bright fluorescent lights. Seeing it again hit me harder than I expected. The smoke damage had darkened parts of the surface, creating streaks and patches that hadn't been there before. The water damage had caused some warping along the edges, where the wet towel had pressed against it for too long. But it was still recognizably the piece Grandma had treasured, still the heirloom I'd promised to protect. I reached out to touch it, and Detective Williams stopped me gently, explaining it needed to stay in evidence until my father's trial was complete. He assured me I'd get it back eventually, probably within a few months, once the legal proceedings wrapped up. I nodded and took photos of the damage with my phone, documenting everything for my own records. The detective walked me through what would happen next with the criminal case, mentioning my father was being held without bail due to flight risk. I left the station feeling lighter despite the visible damage to the heirloom, knowing it was finally safe and my father was finally in custody. 2 days later, my lawyer called with news that my father's public defender had contacted her about a possible plea deal. She explained the defender was suggesting my father would plead guilty to both the theft charge and violating the protective order in exchange for a reduced sentence. My lawyer laid out the options carefully, saying I could accept or reject the plea deal, but warning that going to trial could take another year, and there was always a small chance he could be acquitted if something went wrong with the evidence. I asked what she thought I should do, and she said it was ultimately my decision, but the plea deal would guarantee consequences and let me move forward faster. I sat in my new apartment that night thinking about what Grandma would want. She'd always been practical, always focused on moving forward instead of dwelling on revenge. I called my lawyer the next morning and told her I wanted to accept the plea deal as long as the terms were reasonable. She called back that afternoon with the details. My father would get 4 years for the theft and 1 year for violating the protective order, with the sentences served consecutively instead of at the same time. That meant 5 years total in prison. The plea also included a restitution order requiring him to pay for my therapy costs and compensate me for the diminished value of the heirloom due to the damage he'd caused. My lawyer pointed out it wasn't as much time as he could have gotten if we'd gone to trial and won, but 5 years was substantial, and he'd have a felony record following him for the rest of his life. I agreed to the terms and signed the paperwork she sent over. The sentencing hearing happened 3 weeks later at the county courthouse. I took the morning off work and dressed in my best clothes, wanting to look put together and strong. The courtroom was cold and formal, with wooden benches and harsh lighting that made everyone look tired. My father sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit with his wrists shackled, and he didn't look at me when I walked in and took a seat in the gallery. The judge called the hearing to order, and the prosecutor read the charges and the agreed-upon plea deal into the record. My father's public defender made a brief statement about his client accepting responsibility, though my father's face showed no remorse at all. The judge asked my father directly if he understood the terms and agreed to them, and he answered yes in a flat voice. The judge accepted the plea deal and ordered the restitution payments to start once my father was released from prison in 5 years. I watched the bailiffs lead him away through a side door and felt something settle in my chest, a weight lifting that I'd been carrying since the night of the fire. Both Maverick and my father were finally facing real consequences for what they'd done, and I could actually start moving forward instead of just surviving day to day. I left the courthouse and drove straight to my therapy appointment, wanting to process everything that had just happened. The following week, I met with a professional conservator that my lawyer had recommended. Her studio was filled with antique furniture and artwork in various stages of restoration, and she greeted me warmly before leading me to her workbench. I'd brought the heirloom in its evidence bag, having gotten permission from Detective Williams to have it assessed as long as I returned it to the station afterward. The conservator put on white gloves and carefully examined the piece under a bright magnifying lamp, taking notes and photos as she worked. She explained the smoke damage was permanent and couldn't be reversed without damaging the piece further, but it could be stabilized to prevent additional deterioration. The water damage had affected the structural integrity in ways that couldn't be fully repaired, causing some warping that would always be visible. She gave me the hard news that the heirloom's value had dropped to around $200,000 because of the damage, about half of what it had been worth before the fire. But she emphasized it was still a significant historical piece worth preserving, and the damage didn't diminish its importance to family history. I asked what she recommended for restoration, and she surprised me by suggesting we do minimal intervention. She explained that aggressive restoration might erase the piece's history and make it look artificially perfect, while a careful stabilization would preserve it as it was now, damage and all. I thought about her words and realized the damage was now part of the heirloom story, just like everything else it had survived over the years. The smoke marks and warping were proof of what I'd gone through to protect it, evidence of the promise I'd kept to Grandma. I agreed with her approach and asked how long the conservation work would take. She estimated 3 months and gave me a cost of $8,000, which I could easily cover with the insurance money. I signed her contract and left the heirloom in her care, feeling good about the decision to preserve rather than erase what had happened. During the 3 months while the heirloom was conserved, I settled into my new apartment and continued my regular therapy sessions. My therapist helped me work through the layers of betrayal I'd experienced, first from Maverick and then from my father. She pointed out that my father's actions weren't really about me personally, but about his own character flaws and patterns of behavior that had existed long before I was born. Understanding that helped me stop blaming myself for not seeing through his disguise as my helpful neighbor. I was sleeping better now, usually getting 6 or 7 hours a night instead of the 2 or 3 I'd managed right after the fire. The panic attacks had mostly stopped, though I still got anxious when I heard smoke alarms or unexpected knocks on my door. My therapist said that was normal and would fade with time as my brain learned I was actually safe now. Detective Williams called one afternoon to tell me he was officially closing both cases and would send me copies of all the reports for my records. He mentioned this had been one of the more complicated family dispute cases he'd handled, with the arson and theft intertwining in unusual ways that required coordination between multiple departments. I thanked him for his patience and thoroughness throughout the investigation, telling him I knew I wouldn't have recovered the heirloom without his help. He said he was just doing his job, but seemed genuinely pleased that things had worked out. I hung up feeling grateful for the few people like Detective Williams who'd actually helped me instead of taking advantage during the worst time of my life. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courtroom next to my lawyer, while she organized her files on the table in front of us. The judge walked in, and everyone stood until he took his seat and told us to sit down. My lawyer stood back up when he called our case number, and she approached the bench with a folder full of documents. She started by showing him the original receipt from when Maverick sold me the heirloom for $500, then presented a copy of Grandma's will that mentioned the piece specifically, and confirmed it was hers to dispose of as she wished. Next came the criminal case outcomes, showing both Maverick and my father had been convicted and sentenced for their crimes related to the heirloom. The judge reviewed each document carefully, asking a few questions about the timeline and the relationship between all the parties involved. My lawyer explained everything clearly, and the judge nodded as he made notes on his papers. He asked if there were any objections from the other side, but the courtroom was empty except for us, since neither Maverick nor my father had legal representation at this hearing. After about 20 minutes, the judge declared me the rightful owner of the heirloom and extended both protective orders for 10 years, meaning neither Maverick nor my father could contact me or come within 500 feet of my home until well into the future. I felt relief wash over me as the judge signed the final orders and handed copies to my lawyer. We left the courthouse together, and she congratulated me on the outcome, saying this was the cleanest resolution she'd seen in a family dispute case this complicated. 3 months passed while the conservator worked on stabilizing the heirloom, and I tried to be patient, knowing she was doing important work to preserve it properly. Finally, she called one Tuesday morning and said the piece was ready for me to pick up. I drove to her studio that afternoon, and she met me at the door with a smile, leading me to her workroom where the heirloom sat in a beautiful custom display case on her main table. She walked me through everything she'd done, explaining how she stabilized the smoke-damaged areas without trying to hide or remove the darkening, and how she reinforced the warped sections caused by water damage without altering the piece's original shape. The heirloom looked different from I remembered from Grandma's house, but the conservator was right that the damage told its own story now. She'd created a display case with special glass that would protect it from dust and humidity while still allowing it to be viewed clearly, and she showed me how the case could be opened carefully if I ever needed to access the piece directly. I paid her the $8,000 we'd agreed on and carefully loaded the display case into my car, driving home slowly to avoid any bumps or sudden movements. I brought the heirloom into my apartment and set it on the bookshelf in my living room, where I could see it from my couch. That evening, I just sat there looking at it and thinking about Grandma and the promise I'd made to her in the hospital. I kept my word, even though it cost me my house and forced me to see the worst sides of family members I thought I knew. The heirloom looked different now, with the smoke marks visible along one edge and slight warping in the base, but somehow that felt right, given everything we'd both been through. Grandma would have understood that the damage was part of protecting it, proof that I'd valued the promise more than my own safety. I thought about how she used to tell stories about the piece and its history in our family, and I felt good knowing those stories would continue, even if the heirloom itself bore scars now. A week later, I got a call from a woman who introduced herself as a curator at the local history museum. She explained she'd heard about the heirloom's story through some articles about the criminal cases, and wanted to know if I'd consider putting it on long-term loan for a regional history exhibit they were planning. She described how the museum had proper security systems and climate control that would preserve the piece better than my apartment could, and how it would allow other people to learn about and appreciate its historical meaning. I thought about Grandma and how she always loved sharing the heirloom's history with anyone who'd listen, telling the same stories over and over because she was so proud of our family's connection to the piece. The curator kept talking about their insurance coverage and how my name would be listed as the owner on all the display materials. And I realized this might be exactly what Grandma would have wanted, instead of the heirloom sitting in my apartment where only I could see it. I met with the curator at the museum the following week to discuss the specific terms of the loan agreement. She took me to her office and showed me a draft contract that outlined a 5-year renewable agreement with full insurance coverage for the heirloom's appraised value. The museum would handle all conservation needs and security, and I could visit the piece any time during regular hours or reclaim it with 30 days written notice. My name would appear on the display placard as the owner and lender, and the museum would consult with me on any decisions about how the piece was presented or described. I read through the contract carefully and asked a few questions about what would happen if the museum closed, or if I moved out of state, and she had good answers for everything. The agreement felt fair and respectful of my ownership, while also serving the purpose of sharing the heirloom with the community. I signed the papers feeling confident this was what Grandma would have chosen if she'd been able to decide, the heirloom being appreciated and protected, rather than locked away where nobody else could enjoy it. 2 months later, the museum opened their new exhibit on local family histories, and the heirloom was featured prominently in one section. I attended the opening reception on a Saturday afternoon, and felt proud walking through the gallery, seeing the piece displayed professionally with good lighting and a detailed placard. The placard explained the heirloom's journey through several generations of my family and mentioned its recent recovery after being stolen, though it didn't include the dramatic details about the fire or my father's involvement. Several other visitors stopped to look at the piece while I was standing nearby, and a couple of them commented on the visible smoke damage along one edge. I explained honestly that it had survived a house fire, and the damage was part of its story now, and they seemed to find that even more interesting than if it had been in perfect condition. One older woman told me she appreciated seeing a family heirloom that showed real history instead of looking artificially preserved, and her words made me feel good about the decision to do minimal restoration work. Around the same time, Maverick's wife finalized her divorce and sent me a brief note through my lawyer. The note apologized for everything that had happened and explained she'd had no idea how desperate Maverick had become or what he was planning to do. She wrote that she was moving to another state to rebuild her life away from the whole situation and hoped I could find peace after everything I'd been through. I read the note twice and then put it in a drawer without responding because I wasn't ready to forgive her veiled threats from before the fire, even if she claimed she didn't know about Maverick's plans. My lawyer called a few days later and mentioned the wife had cooperated fully with prosecutors in exchange for not being charged as an accessory, and she was apparently doing well in her new location. I appreciated that the wife had at least acknowledged her part in the situation, but I didn't feel any need to reach out or maintain contact with that part of my past. My insurance company sent a final settlement check that included compensation for temporary housing expenses and some belongings I'd forgotten to claim on my original paperwork. The extra $3,000 was unexpected, and I deposited it immediately, using some of the money to buy a proper bed frame and dresser for my apartment instead of the cheap temporary furniture I'd been using. I also added $1,000 to my emergency savings account, wanting to have a cushion in case anything unexpected happened again. My apartment was starting to feel stable and comfortable now, with decent furniture and the heirloom safely preserved at the museum, and I realized I was finally rebuilding a normal life after months of chaos and stress. I established a routine over the next few weeks that included my regular therapy appointments every Tuesday, visits to see the heirloom at the museum every other Saturday, and monthly check-ins with Detective Williams, who'd become something like a friend through this whole process. My therapist helped me work through the remaining anxiety about unexpected knocks on my door or smoke alarms going off, and she pointed out how much progress I'd made since those first sessions when I could barely sleep. Detective Williams would call to see how I was doing, and sometimes we'd meet for coffee to catch up, and he mentioned he was glad to see a case end with the victim actually recovering and moving forward, instead of staying stuck in trauma. My apartment felt like home now, instead of just a temporary place I was staying, and I'd made peace with the fact that some family relationships were better left in the past. The protective orders meant I wouldn't have to deal with either Maverick or my father for at least 10 years, which gave me space to focus on building a life without looking over my shoulder constantly. 6 months after the fire, I started attending a victim support group that my therapist had recommended for people dealing with family betrayal. The group met every Thursday evening in a community center basement and had about 8 regular members who'd all experienced relatives stealing from them or hurting them in various ways. I shared my story about the heirloom and everything that happened with Maverick and my father, and hearing their reactions helped me realize I wasn't alone in dealing with family members who prioritized greed over relationships. One woman had a brother who'd stolen her inheritance, another man's uncle had forged documents to take his house, and everyone had similar feelings about the unique pain of being betrayed by people who were supposed to care about you. Several group members asked about the museum exhibit after I mentioned it, and 3 of them came with me the following Saturday to see the heirloom and hear more details about its history. We ended up getting coffee afterward and talking for 2 hours, and I realized these people understood what I'd been through in ways my other friends couldn't, because they'd lived through similar experiences themselves. A few weeks after that coffee meetup, I got an envelope in my mailbox from the state prison system with my father's inmate number printed on the return address. I opened it standing right there by the mailboxes and found a check for $50 made out to me with a payment stub explaining it was court-ordered restitution. The amount was tiny compared to what he'd cost me, but seeing that check meant he was actually working some prison job to pay me back every month. I took a photo of it and texted it to my lawyer, who replied that these payments would continue for years, even after his release, a permanent reminder of his greed. I deposited the check that afternoon and added it to a separate savings account I'd created just for tracking his payments. My apartment building posted flyers about a community BBQ the following Saturday, and I almost didn't go because the idea of meeting new neighbors still made me nervous after everything with my father. But my therapist had been encouraging me to practice trusting people again in low-stakes situations, so I forced myself to walk down to the courtyard, where they'd set up grills and picnic tables. A couple from the unit next to mine introduced themselves, and we talked about normal things like the building's parking situation and the best grocery stores nearby. The retired teacher who lived down the hall joined our conversation and mentioned she was starting a book club if anyone was interested. I found myself actually enjoying the casual small talk and exchanged phone numbers with both the couple and the teacher. Walking back to my apartment later, I realized I'd spent 2 hours at the event without once thinking about Maverick or my father or checking over my shoulder for threats. The museum curator called me on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for work and asked if I had a few minutes to discuss the heirloom exhibit. She explained that visitor numbers had exceeded their expectations, and several local history organizations had requested information about the piece. The museum wanted to extend the loan agreement another year and feature the heirloom more prominently in their promotional materials for the upcoming regional history series. She asked permission to include more details about the recovery story in the exhibit text, explaining how it had survived the fire and been recovered from theft. I agreed immediately, as long as they kept my name out of it, wanting the focus to stay on the heirloom's historical significance rather than my personal drama. The curator thanked me and mentioned they were already seeing school groups schedule visits specifically to see the piece. After we hung up, I sat on my couch thinking about how hundreds of people were now appreciating something I'd almost lost completely. I drove to the cemetery that weekend for the first time since Grandma's funeral 8 months earlier. I'd been avoiding it because I wasn't sure what to say to her after everything that happened, but I finally felt ready to visit. I found her grave under the oak tree she'd picked out years before and sat down on the grass next to the headstone. I told her the whole story out loud, even though I felt silly talking to a grave, explaining how I'd kept my promise despite Maverick setting my house on fire and my father stealing the heirloom while pretending to save me. I described the court cases and the protective orders and how the heirloom was now on display at the museum where people could learn about its history. I explained that the piece had smoke and water damage from that night, but it was stable and protected now. Sitting there in the quiet cemetery, I felt like she would have been proud of how I'd handled everything, and the weight of that deathbed promise finally lifted off my shoulders. I stayed for another hour just sitting with her before driving home. My therapy appointments shifted focus over the next few months, from processing the trauma to planning for my future. My therapist helped me identify patterns in how I'd trusted people too easily before and gave me tools for recognizing red flags in relationships. We worked on setting boundaries and understanding that being cautious didn't mean being damaged or unable to connect with others. She pointed out how much I'd grown since those early sessions when I couldn't sleep and jumped at every unexpected noise. I wasn't the same person who'd trusted my fake neighbor without question anymore, but I also wasn't so hurt that I couldn't form new friendships with my actual neighbors or the people from my support group. The growth felt hard-won but real, earned by surviving something I never expected to face. My therapist reduced our sessions to twice a month instead of weekly, saying I was doing well and had developed good coping strategies. The 1-year anniversary of the fire arrived on a Tuesday, and I decided to mark it by hosting a small dinner party at my apartment that Saturday. I invited the couple from next door, the retired teacher from down the hall, and 3 people from my support group who'd become genuine friends over the past months. I spent Friday evening cooking lasagna and garlic bread, and Saturday afternoon cleaning my apartment and setting up my small dining table with the nice dishes I'd bought to replace everything that burned. My guests arrived around 6, and we spent the evening eating good food and sharing stories about our lives. Nobody asked about the heirloom or brought up my family drama unless I mentioned it first, and I appreciated how they treated me like a normal person instead of a victim. We played board games after dinner and laughed about stupid things, and the evening felt comfortable and easy. After everyone left around 10, I cleaned up the dishes, thinking about how I'd actually built a life beyond the trauma that had defined so many months. I got a thick envelope from my lawyer's office the following week, containing copies of court documents showing both protective orders had been reviewed and extended for the full 10 years, as originally ordered. The paperwork confirmed Maverick had 14 years left on his sentence for arson and attempted murder, while my father had 4 years remaining for theft and violating the protective order. My lawyer included a note explaining this meant I had a long period of guaranteed safety from both of them, and I should contact her office if either one tried to reach out after their eventual release. She filed all the paperwork in my case folder and marked it as closed for now, though she said to call any time if I needed anything. I put the documents in my fire safe box and felt relieved, knowing I could simply live my life without looking over my shoulder constantly or worrying about surprise confrontations. I visited the museum on a quiet Tuesday afternoon a few weeks later and stood in front of the heirloom display, watching other visitors pause to read its story. A young couple stopped next to me, and the woman pointed at the visible smoke marks on the piece's surface. Her boyfriend read the placard aloud, explaining how the heirloom had survived a fire during a theft attempt, and they discussed how the damage made it more interesting because it showed the piece had lived through something significant. The woman said she appreciated seeing an artifact that wasn't perfect and pristine, that the marks told a story beyond just its age and craftsmanship. I smiled, listening to them understand exactly what I'd learned through all of this, that surviving and being protected mattered more than staying undamaged. They moved on to the next display, and I stayed there a few more minutes looking at the heirloom behind its protective glass. It was exactly where it belonged, being appreciated and preserved and shared with people who could learn from its history. I'd kept my promise to Grandma in a way that honored both the past and the future, and standing there in that quiet museum, I finally felt at peace with everything that had happened.